listen closely. Tonight we walk through a place most travelers never see. Not the bright halls of kings, not the lively markets of medieval towns, but the quiet corridors of a forgotten castle. A place where the wind moves slowly through broken windows, and where old stones still remember the voices of a family that once lived here. Long ago, in a distant corner of the medieval world, there was a noble house known across the valleys and forests. A powerful family, a respected family, a family that possessed land, soldiers, wealth, and influence. But beneath the calm surface of their noble life, something dark slowly began to grow. Not an enemy army, not famine, not plague. Long before the tragedy began, before the whispers of betrayal, before the nights filled with fear, there stood a proud castle on the edge of a wide green valley. It was known as Ashford Keep. The castle rested on a rocky hill, surrounded by forests of oak and pine. From its high stone walls, one could see miles of farmland stretching toward the horizon. Small villages dotted the countryside. Farmers worked the fields. Smoke rose gently from cottage chimneys in the cold mornings. And at the center of it all stood the keep of the Ashford family. For generations, the Ashfords had ruled this land. They were not kings, but they were powerful enough that even neighboring nobles treated them with caution and respect. The family crest displayed a silver stag standing beneath a crescent moon, a symbol meant to represent strength, patience, and quiet watchfulness. At the head of the family during our story was Lord William Ashford. He was a tall man with graying hair and calm, watchful eyes. Unlike many nobles of his time, William was known for his patience rather than his temper. He preferred quiet strategy over open conflict. Instead of endless wars with neighboring lords, he strengthened his lands through alliances, trade, and careful diplomacy. Under his rule, the Ashford lands prospered. The villages grew. The fields produced abundant harvests. Merchants traveled safely through the valley, and the castle itself became known as a place of stability in a turbulent world. But even the strongest families are equipped not only by their leaders, but by their children. Lord William had 3 sons, and each of them was very different. The eldest was Edward Ashford. Edward had been raised since childhood to inherit the family lands. He carried himself with the confidence expected of a future lord. He was disciplined, serious, and respected by the knights who trained him. But there was something else in Edward's nature, a quiet pride, a belief that the future of the Ashford family rested entirely on his shoulders. The second son was Thomas Ashford. Thomas was different from his older brother. Where Edward was rigid and formal, Thomas was curious and thoughtful. He spent long hours in the castle library studying maps, histories, and distant kingdoms. Some of the knights quietly joked that Thomas would have made a better scholar than a lord. Yet he possessed a sharp mind and a talent for seeing possibilities others overlooked. The youngest son was Robert Ashford. Robert had been born many years after his brothers. He grew up in a different atmosphere than the one Edward had known. By the time Robert was a child, the Ashford lands were already prosperous and secure. He had never experienced the uncertainty that shaped his older brothers. Robert was charming, lively, and well-liked, but he also carried a restless spirit. While Edward trained with swords and Thomas studied books, Robert often disappeared into the forests surrounding the castle. He hunted. He rode his horse through narrow woodland paths. He spoke with villagers and travelers, He seemed less interested in the rigid expectations of noble life. To outsiders, the Ashford family appeared strong. 3 sons, healthy lands, a respected name. The future seemed secure. But inside the castle walls, small tensions were already beginning to form. Edward believed the role of heir gave him authority over his brothers. Thomas believed intelligence should matter more than birth order. And Robert believed neither of them truly understood the world beyond the castle. At first, these differences were small. Simple disagreements during meals, quiet debates during family gatherings, moments where sharp words were spoken and quickly forgotten. But time has a strange way of turning small cracks into deep fractures. Years passed. The 3 brothers grew into men. Edward became a knight. Thomas began assisting his father with diplomacy and trade. Robert spent more and more time away from the castle, traveling to nearby towns and markets. From the outside, the Ashford family still looked strong. But inside the castle, something subtle was changing. A quiet competition had begun, each brother slowly trying to prove his worth, trying to prove that he was the one most deserving of the Ashford legacy. And though Lord William tried to keep peace between his sons, even he could sense the shifting atmosphere inside the great hall. Sometimes during evening meals, he would watch them carefully. Edward sitting upright with rigid posture, Thomas observing silently with thoughtful eyes, Robert leaning back in his chair with a faint smile. 3 sons. Three different visions of the future, and somewhere deep within the castle's old stone walls, the first seeds of destruction were quietly taking root. Seeds that would one day grow into betrayal, fear, and bloodshed. But on those early evenings in Ashford Keep, no one yet understood where those small tensions would lead. The torches still burned warmly along the stone corridors. The servants moved quietly through the halls, and outside the castle windows, the valley slept peacefully beneath the moon. The Ashford family still believed their future was secure. They had land. They had wealth. They had power. What they did not yet realize was that the greatest danger they would ever face was already sitting at their own table. In the early years of their adulthood, the 3 Ashford brothers still appeared united. Visitors who came to the castle saw a powerful, noble house with a clear future. The eldest son trained with the knights. The second son advised his father. The youngest son charmed the court and the countryside alike. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. But inside the walls of Ashford Keep, quiet tensions slowly deepened. It began with small moments. A look held slightly too long. A disagreement at the dinner table. A comment that sounded harmless, yet carried an edge beneath its calm tone. Edward, as the eldest, believed his position was unquestionable. To him, the structure of noble life was simple. The firstborn inherited. The others supported the family in different ways. That had always been the order of things, yet Thomas did not fully agree. Though he respected tradition, he also believed intelligence and judgment mattered more than birth order alone. More than once, he offered advice that contradicted Edward during discussions with their father. Sometimes, Lord William listened, and each time that happened, Edward felt something quietly tighten within him. Robert, meanwhile, seemed uninterested in either argument, or at least, that was what he allowed others to believe. In truth, Robert watched his brothers very carefully. He noticed how Edward's jaw tightened when Thomas spoke during council discussions. He noticed how Thomas avoided meeting Edward's gaze after certain disagreements. Robert understood something that neither of them yet admitted openly. The family was no longer moving in the same direction. The cracks were forming, and cracks in noble families rarely remain small for long. Years continued to pass. The medieval world outside the castle remained unpredictable. Wars erupted between distant lords. Trade routes shifted. Rumors of plague sometimes drifted through traveling merchants. But within the Ashford lands, life remained stable. Lord William's careful leadership protected the valley. The villages prospered, and the castle continued to stand as a symbol of calm authority. Yet even strong walls cannot silence the slow movement of human ambition. One autumn evening, the first serious fracture appeared. It began during a council meeting. The room was lit by several tall candles placed along a heavy wooden table. Maps were spread across the surface. Several knights and advisors stood quietly around the room. A merchant from a neighboring region had proposed a trade alliance. The deal promised wealth and influence, but it also required the Ashford family to support that region in a potential future conflict. Edward immediately supported the alliance. Strength, he argued, came from powerful allies. Thomas disagreed. He believed the agreement carried hidden risks. The neighboring region had a reputation for unstable leadership. Entering their conflicts could pull Ashford lands into unnecessary wars. For several minutes, the brothers debated calmly, but slowly the conversation sharpened. Edward's voice grew colder. Thomas spoke with increasing firmness. At the head of the table, Lord William listened silently. Finally, after considering both arguments, he made his decision. He sided with Thomas. The alliance would be declined. The room fell quiet. For a moment, no one spoke. Edward said nothing. The silence that surrounded him carried weight. A heavy, uncomfortable silence. That night, the castle corridors felt different. Servants moved more carefully than usual. Whispers traveled through the kitchens and guard halls. The brothers had disagreed before, but this time, something deeper had shifted. Edward spent most of the evening alone in the training yard. Under the faint light of the moon, he practiced with his sword, long after the other knights had gone to sleep. The sound of steel cutting through the air echoed across the quiet stone walls, again and again. Again. Inside the castle, Thomas remained in the library. He sat beside a small oil lamp, studying old records and trade maps. But even as he read, his thoughts drifted back to the council chamber. He knew Edward would not forget what had happened. And Robert? Robert walked the outer walls of the castle. The night air was cold and still. From the high battlements, he could see the dark forests stretching across the valley. Owls called softly from distant trees. Robert leaned against the stone wall and watched the moonlight touch the rooftops of the villages below. A faint smile crossed his face. Not a cruel smile. Not yet. But the quiet smile of someone who understood that the future had just become uncertain. From that evening forward, something invisible settled over the Ashford family. The brothers still spoke politely. They still sat together during meals. They still appeared united when guests visited the castle. But the warmth that once existed between them slowly faded. Edward grew more distant. Thomas grew more cautious. Robert grew more observant. Lord William noticed the change. Of course he did. Fathers often sense these things before anyone else. Yet he hoped time would smooth the tension. He believed his sons were intelligent enough to overcome their differences. After all, the Ashford legacy depended on their unity. What he did not realize was that the conflict between his sons was no longer simply about pride or about influence. It had quietly become something deeper, something more dangerous. A question of who truly deserved the future of the Ashford name. And in the medieval world, questions like that rarely ended peacefully. Winter slowly approached the valley. Cold winds began sweeping through the forests. Frost formed on the castle stones during early mornings. Inside Ashford Keep, the great hall fires burned longer each night, but warmth from the hearth could not restore the quiet bond that once existed between the brothers. Instead, the castle became a place of careful words and guarded glances. Days passed, then weeks, and somewhere in those silent weeks, the first truly dangerous thought entered the mind of one of the brothers. A thought so dark, so irreversible, that once it appeared, the fate of the Ashford family would never again be the same. But that night, the snow began to fall softly over the valley. Ashford Keep still slept in uneasy peace. The torches flickered along the corridors. The guards walked their silent patrols, and in separate chambers across the castle, 3 brothers lay awake in the darkness, each one staring into the quiet shadows, each one wondering what the future of the Ashford bloodline would become, and none of them yet realizing how close that future stood to its end. Winter settled deeply over the Ashford Valley. Snow rested quietly across the fields and rooftops of the small villages below the castle. The forests stood still beneath a pale sky, and Ashford Keep, built of heavy gray stone, rose above it all like a silent guardian, watching over the sleeping land. Inside the castle, life moved slowly during the colder months. Travel became difficult. Trade caravans arrived less frequently. Many days passed in calm routine. Servants carried wood for the great hall fires. Knights trained in the covered courtyard. And the Ashford family gathered together each evening for supper beneath the tall wooden beams of the great hall. At least, they gathered in appearance, but the warmth that once filled those dinners had faded. Where laughter once echoed across the long table, now silence often settled between the brothers. Edward sat upright beside his father, as tradition required. Thomas usually remained quiet, observing more than speaking. Robert sometimes arrived late, brushing snow from his cloak before taking his place. Each man carried his own thoughts. Each man watched the others carefully. The first incident happened on a night that seemed completely ordinary. Outside, snow fell softly. Inside the hall, the large fireplace burned warmly. Servants moved quietly between the tables, carrying bowls of stew, roasted meat, and dark bread. The Ashford family had just begun their meal. Conversation remained polite but restrained. Lord William asked Thomas about recent trade reports from nearby towns. Edward spoke briefly with one of the knights about patrol routes through the forest roads. Robert leaned back slightly in his chair, listening. Then something unusual happened. Edward paused. He lowered his spoon slowly. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he placed his hand against the edge of the table. The movement was small, but noticeable. Lord William looked toward him. Edward? Edward's expression had changed. His face had grown pale. A faint line of tension crossed his brow. I feel... He began quietly. Then he stopped. His breathing had grown slightly uneven. The hall slowly fell silent. Thomas set down his cup. Robert straightened slightly in his chair. Edward pressed a hand against his stomach. A servant hurried closer. Lord William rose from his seat. What is it? He asked calmly. Edward did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, then another. Finally, he spoke again. I believe something in the food does not agree with me. The words were spoken carefully, but they lingered heavily in the air. A noble castle was a place where many dangers existed. But there was one danger that always terrified great families more than any other. Poison. The hall remained silent for several seconds. The servants froze where they stood. Thomas and Robert exchanged a brief glance. Lord William spoke calmly. Bring fresh water. A servant quickly obeyed. Edward drank slowly. After several minutes, his breathing steadied. The color slowly returned to his face. Whatever had troubled him seemed to fade. Eventually, he managed a faint smile. Perhaps I simply worked too long in the cold today. The tension in the hall slowly eased. Conversations resumed. Servants continued serving the meal. Yet something had changed. Even though Edward appeared to recover, a quiet question lingered in everyone's mind. Had it truly been nothing? Or had something far more dangerous just occurred? Later that night, the castle corridors grew quiet. Torches flickered along the stone walls. Most of the household had already gone to sleep. But inside the private chambers of the Ashford family, the evening's event was not easily forgotten. Lord William sat alone beside a candle. His thoughts were heavy. He had lived long enough to recognize the subtle signs of danger. And though he said nothing aloud, he could not completely dismiss the possibility that the food had been tampered with. Thomas also remained awake. He walked slowly through the library, his fingers brushing along rows of old books. His mind replayed the dinner scene again and again. The sudden illness, Edward's pale expression, the uneasy silence in the hall. Thomas was not a suspicious man by nature, but logic guided his thinking. And logic told him that illness appearing so suddenly during a meal could mean many things. Natural sickness, spoiled food, or something else. Something deliberate. Across the castle, Robert sat beside the narrow window of his chamber. Snow continued falling outside. He watched the flakes drift slowly through the pale moonlight. His expression remained calm, but his thoughts moved quietly, very quietly. The castle itself seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Ashford Keep had stood for generations. Its walls had witnessed births, weddings, celebrations, and mourning. But now it watched something else beginning. Suspicion. And suspicion within a noble family was like a spark in dry wood. Small at first, easy to dismiss, but capable of growing into something uncontrollable. The following days passed without incident. Edward returned to his normal routines. He trained with the knights. He attended council discussions. He showed no further signs of illness. Life appeared to return to normal. But beneath the surface, the brothers were no longer as relaxed as before. Edward began paying closer attention during meals. Thomas quietly observed the servants preparing food. Robert continued to watch everyone. Weeks later, it happened again. This time, the reaction was smaller. Robert briefly felt dizzy after drinking wine during supper. The moment passed quickly. So quickly that some might have ignored it. But Edward did not ignore it. Neither did Thomas. Two strange moments, two different brothers, both during meals, neither easily explained. Lord William finally gave a quiet order to the castle steward. From that night forward, all food served to the Ashford family would first be tasted by a designated servant. The practice was not uncommon in medieval noble houses. Food tasting had long been used to protect against poisoning, but the decision itself carried meaning. It confirmed something everyone had begun to suspect. Trust within the castle walls had begun to weaken. Servants whispered quietly in the kitchens. Knights discussed the situation during late patrols. No one spoke openly of poison, but the possibility hung in the air like distant thunder. And within the Ashford family itself, something subtle but dangerous had begun. Edward trusted his brother slightly less. Thomas questioned every unusual event. Robert continued observing, and though none of them yet accused the others directly, a quiet understanding was forming. If someone truly had attempted to poison a member of the family, then the enemy might not be outside the castle walls. The enemy might already be sitting at the Ashford table. Night after night, the castle grew quieter. Even the great hall felt different. Candles burned low. Meals ended sooner. Conversations became shorter. The once peaceful Ashford household had begun its slow transformation. Not through open war, not through dramatic violence, but through something far more unsettling. Doubt, and doubt, once planted inside a family, can slowly grow into something far darker. Because when trust disappears, even the closest blood can begin to look like a threat. And in the silent halls of Ashford Keep, that transformation had already begun. The Ashford brothers had not yet turned against one another openly, but the path leading there had quietly begun. And once a family steps onto that path, it rarely finds its way back. Winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the valley. The snow that had covered the fields for months gradually melted beneath the returning sun. Small streams formed along the edges of the forests. Birds returned to the branches of the tall oaks surrounding Ashford Keep. From the outside, the world appeared to be waking peacefully from its long sleep. But inside the castle walls, the atmosphere had grown far colder than the winter that had just passed. The strange incidents during the family meals had changed something deep within the Ashford household. Even though no one had spoken openly about poison, the idea could not be forgotten. And once suspicion enters a family, it begins to quietly reshape every interaction. Edward became the first to change. The eldest Ashford son had always been disciplined, but now his discipline became something sharper, more controlled, more guarded. He no longer left his wine unattended. He watched the servants closely as they brought food to the table. He even changed the order in which he tasted the dishes placed before him. To outsiders, these were small habits, but inside the castle everyone noticed. Thomas also began moving differently through the castle. He spent longer hours in the library studying old family records, not simply histories of land and trade, but documents concerning inheritance, laws, titles, rights of succession, the rules that determined who truly controlled a noble family's future. Thomas had always been thoughtful, but now his curiosity had direction. Meanwhile, Robert continued to appear the least concerned. He still rode through the forests. He still visited nearby villages. He still spoke easily with servants and travelers. But beneath that relaxed appearance, Robert was learning something valuable. Information. While Edward focused on strength and Thomas focused on strategy, Robert focused on people. He listened. He asked quiet questions. He paid attention to rumors drifting through the castle kitchens and guard posts. Because sometimes the smallest voices hear the most important things. And slowly, Robert began noticing patterns. Certain servants seemed nervous during meals. One kitchen worker had recently left the castle unexpectedly. A guard had mentioned seeing someone moving through the halls late at night. None of these details meant much on their own, but together they formed a puzzle. And Robert enjoyed solving puzzles. Weeks passed. Spring slowly arrived. The valley below the castle turned green again. Farmers returned to the fields. Life resumed its steady rhythm. Yet, inside Ashford Keep, the family had already begun dividing into quiet sides. Edward increasingly relied on the loyalty of the castle knights, men who respected his strength and leadership. Thomas found support among the scribes and advisors who valued his intelligence. Robert, meanwhile, maintained friendly connections with servants, messengers, and travelers. 3 brothers. 3 networks of loyalty forming quietly inside the same castle. Lord William observed these changes with growing concern. He had hoped the strange illness during the winter meals would fade into memory. Instead, the tension seemed to deepen. The brothers still treated each other with outward respect, but something had changed behind their eyes. Trust was gone.